All right, picking up where I left off, this is our week 3 review video, chapter 5, part 2. I just finished talking about groups in the previous part, so now I'm going to talk a little bit about networks. Um, in sociology, as well as a number of other sciences, we do what's called social network analysis, which is looking at how um, networks are interconnected and creating, oftentimes creating these visual representations, as you can see here, of a network. A network is basically a set of connections between individuals, um, which can be a group or it can contain multiple groups. A network can be much larger than just a single group. In your own personal social network, for example, you could have different groups of people, like your work friends and your school friends, which don't necessarily know each other but are connected through you. So in this example, we can see there are two main sort of networks here that are highly interconnected with one another and only a few connections in between them connecting them. These connections we refer to as ties, and it's basically the relationship or the connection between these two people, which we can also think of as being kind of like the story that you tell to explain what that relationship is, whether it's a friendship or a family member or whatever. And individuals, these points, we refer to as nodes. So in social network analysis, we oftentimes look at the structure of these networks and how they're interconnected. And the book talks about a lot of interesting things with networks. For example, the concept of embeddedness is a very important point. Somebody who is highly embedded within a network is someone who has a lot of connections to other people within that network. So for example, if you're in a group of or a network of 6 people and you're connected to all 5 of the other people, you would be very highly embedded within that network. So your place within that network is very reinforced. Whereas another person may only be connected to 2 other people within that network, they would have a lower level of embeddedness in that particular network. And one of the most important theories within social network analysis is from Mark Granovetter, and it's referred to as the strength of weak ties. And Granovetter was particularly interested in the idea that ties can be both strong or weak, and that these can have different meanings. A strong tie are people that you know very well, people you're very close to, people you see on a regular basis, oftentimes like your family or your close friends. And then your weak ties are people who you know but are not particularly close to. These can be more like acquaintances or old friends that you maybe don't see very often anymore, things like that. And we tend to all have small groups of close ties and then a much broader group of weak ties in our own personal social networks. And Granovetter's argument basically was that these ties can have different functions. Just because something is a weak tie does not mean that it's necessarily less helpful or less functional. A strong tie can be very important if you are, for example, if you lock your keys in your car in the middle of the night and you need to call someone to come and help you, you're probably going to call one of your strong ties that you can rely on. But if you're trying to get a job, which is something Granovetter focused his analysis on, and you're trying to access information, the weak ties are your best source for that because your weak ties are typically going to be connected to other networks as well that you're not connected to. And so they're going to be able to provide you with information such as job leads that you might not be able to find otherwise. Um, the people that you have strong ties with are people you often see on a regular basis, so they probably have much of the same information that you already have. But with a lot of weak ties, we can get a much broader and more diverse source of information. So if you think about it like your Facebook wall, we oftentimes have lots of weak ties in our Facebook friends, and as a result, all of the posts that we see on our news feed, we get a wide diversity of information and news from that because of all these different weak ties that we have. And social media is really interesting in this regard because it's very specifically focused on social networks, and and it's allowed a lot of people in recent years to be able to broaden their their weak ties and get back in touch with people that maybe they haven't seen in a while, or people that they only know, um, are only acquaintances with, or only met a couple of times. It allows you to stay in touch with that person so you can maintain that weak tie. So it also points out in the textbook the idea of a structural whole. We can also think about this in terms of something like Facebook. When it says on your timeline or on your news feed, when it suggests that you should be friends with somebody, that's because it's identifying a structural hole in your network. It's basically saying that, hey, you and this other person both are connected to a lot of the same people, but you're not connected with each other. So that's a structural hole within this network. So it's suggesting that perhaps you two should be friends with each other and connect with each other, and then fill that hole, basically. Um, so, networks tend to be kind of abstract in the real world, but it's really interesting when we can plot it visually like this. We can think about literally like the structure of it and how these different structures can affect group dynamics and how people interact with one another. Um, One interesting example the book points out is the idea of 6 degrees of separation. Um, and that's this argument that everybody is connected within 6 degrees, or sort of 6 steps, that you can connect pretty much anybody in the world with anyone else. And you may have seen this done through a game about Kevin Bacon. There's the 6 degrees of Kevin Bacon, which is the idea that the actor Kevin Bacon can be connected to any other actor in the world through only 6 degrees or less, through films that people have starred in. There's actually a website called theoracleofbacon.org, in which you can do this and test this, which is really interesting. Now, more recent studies have actually found that if you take the whole world into consideration, it may be a little more than 6 degrees, although the majority of people in the world, according to the study by Watts, he actually found that most people are connected by 6 degrees or less through different social networks. Um, and importantly, the book also refers to a concept called social capital. Now, social capital is a very important concept, much like economic capital could refer to money and wealth and that sort of thing. Social capital refers to your access to people as an information source and how that can be beneficial to you. So, for example, well, social capital is largely a function of your position within a social network. So for this picture here, we can see this node right here, this person, has 9 connections to this other network over here. And in fact, there's only 2 other people that also have connections to that network. So this person actually would have a very high degree of social capital, because not only is he connected with all of these people in his own network and has access to all the information that they can provide, such as job leads, but he also has access to a number of different peoples in this whole other network that these other folks don't have access to. So through him, he can share information of these guys with this other network over here, and vice versa. And that gives him extra social capital, because he has access to information that other people do not have access to, which he can share with them. So social capital generally refers to our connectedness with one another. Um, you may have heard the phrase before, it's not what you know, it's who you know, that gives you sort of the most advantages in life. And that's a reference to social capital, really. Um, and there's some interesting studies that have been done about this in recent years. They mention a study by Putnam called Bowling Alone. This was a book that he published back in 2000, which he did a study and found that he argues that social capital is actually declining in the United States, from the 70s to about the 2000s when he published the study. And he measured this in terms of people's participation in volunteer and civic organizations and things like bowling teams, and found that people were generally becoming more sort of isolated and individualistic, and as a result, we're losing social capital by losing our connectedness to each other. But of course, this was before social media became popular, so it's arguably, things have changed a lot since then. Some people argue social media reduces the quality of our interconnections with one another, but at the same time, it can really help us maintain a much larger number of weak ties with people, which can be very, very beneficial in terms of social capital, such as if you were trying to find a job or something. And some other studies have also pointed out that after 9/11, for example, there was a sudden increase again in social participation and volunteerism. Um, it's also been argued uh, that this sort of so-called decline in social capital is not really that much of a negative thing. I believe it's Michael Gaddis points that out as well. So it's kind of a tricky issue, but social capital is a very important concept to understand, and they illustrate it well through an example here in the book where they show an analysis of teenage sex in high schools. And on figure 5.5 and 5.6, they show some illustrations, which are some examples of visual plots of social networks of the sexual relations of high school students that were being studied and how they were all interconnected and how this contributed to the spread of STDs, sexually transmitted diseases, among these high school students. So that's a very good example of that applied to the real world. Now, actually in my own research, I use this quite a bit. I'm working on a paper right now. I'm hoping to publish soon about. I look at social movements like protest events, and I have one particular protest event that was organized largely through Twitter. So it's kind of an informal event with no official leadership structure, but people use Twitter to help organize. And so by looking at all the tweets, basically by gathering, I had about 3.5 million tweets I gathered over 3 days that all use certain hashtags related to this protest event. And I can look at those and I can plot them out visually in a network like this to show, for example, which people have the highest degree of embeddedness, which people have the highest degrees of social capital, by connecting different groups of people, which people are most influential in various ways, like who got the most retweets and things like that, which individuals were able to communicate the most with other people. So it really helps us to understand the dynamics of how these kinds of events occur and how people are able to self-organize in the absence of official organizational structures. So there's a lot of different interesting ways in which this type of social network analysis can be applied. And social media really, really helps that because it creates a whole written record that you can go back and look at and really trace these kinds of communications very specifically in the connections between people. And just to wrap it up, the book also talks about organizations, organizational culture, organizational structure. When you have structure within an organization, it naturally creates power relations. As I kind of mentioned earlier with large groups, was one of Zimmel's ideas. This can create a number of different um, contentious power relations and inequalities and things like that. They also mention the idea of isomorphism, which is an interesting word, and basically refers to how organizations over time, even if they try to differentiate themselves from each other, can end up sort of taking on the same characteristics and the same behaviors because these organizations typically are operating within the same environments and responding to the same context and stimuli. And so as a result, they tend to um, start to mimic each other over time, which is an interesting pattern that sociologists have observed. So that's another good thing to read all about that. Um, yeah, that's the end of the chapter. So there's some very interesting aspects of this. There's some free software you can download actually. There's one program that I like to use called NodeXL. It's NODEXL. And it's a free software you can download that allows you to do your own social network analysis. You can, for example, plug in your Facebook profile and it will create a visual plot of your network of your own social network based on who you're friends with, and show you all the different groupings of like these are your school friends, these are your family friends, things like that, and how they're interconnected. It's very interesting and it's free, so I highly suggest checking it out. And Stay tuned for chapter 6.